Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor Fravel. Welcome to the MIT SSP Wednesday seminar. I'm really delighted today to welcome Michael Mazarr from the RAND Corporation in Washington, D.C., where he's a senior political scientist and also a professor of analysis at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. He previously worked at the U.S Naval War College, where he was professor and associate dean of academics, and as president of the Henry L. Stimson Center, a senior fellow at CSIS, a senior defense aide on Capitol Hill, and as a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Staff. So he's had really a tremendous range of experience on national security issues. His primary interests are U.S. defense policy and force structure, disinformation and information manipulation, among many others. He holds a PhD in public policy from the University of Maryland, and today is going to be speaking to us on the coming strategic revolution of artificial intelligence, the U.S. China contest, and the sources of competitive advantage. So, Mike, welcome to MIT.
Thanks so much. And it's okay, I'll just speak from here. It's easier to see my notes. Really delighted to be with you today to talk about this fascinating topic that a few people know a lot about, and most of us know only a little bit. It's always challenging to imagine speaking about this topic in particular, because there could be such a range of thinking in the audience, or range of experience and expertise. Some of you may be deep into the technology of AI. Some of you may have thought about a lot about it in terms of its general implications. Some of you may have begun to think about it in the U.S. China context. Some of you may be coming from extensive U.S. China experience and integrating that. So I'm going to touch on a variety of things. Some of them, I'm sure, will be old hat to some people in the room, but hopefully in the range, there'll be something that might provoke each of you. So where does this talk come from? Over about the last year at RAND, we have got very seriously into the issue of geopolitics of artificial intelligence, with a particular focus on U.S.-China competition. We have something called the Technology and Security Policy Center, which has, I think, 60 or 70 people now, fellows and full-time folks. Some of them are doing very technical work on AI, on different aspects of the technology, on safety issues, some on U.S.-China issues, such as open source assessment of Chinese projects in the area, assessment of the chip controls and other export controls, things like that. And in the process of this research over the last year, we've enjoyed a lot of discussions with folks from the labs, folks in government, people working on this issue from various sorts of areas. So I am not a technology person. If you start to ask me questions about AI as a technology, that will last about 60 to 90 seconds. But I've been bringing my kind of general background in U.S. national security strategies, thinking about this in the U.S.-China context, and trying to educate myself as much as possible on some of the technical pieces. Because one of the interesting aspects, as I'll talk briefly about, is there's a bunch of aspects of how the technology could evolve that will have critical implications for what kind of strategic implications it will have. And sometimes even seemingly very narrow things like open models versus proprietary models. There was a recent foreign affairs piece on this. How that plays out in and of itself could have a dramatic implication on what the U.S.-China competition ends up looking like. There clearly is a competition brewing. Some people call it a race. You've seen some of the assessments of, Henry Kissinger, Eric Schmidt, Leopold Aschenbrenner's famous piece, Situational Awareness, essentially described the entire what the U.S. should be obsessed about is the fact that we are now in a race with an autocratic authoritarian state for control of the technology that's going to determine the future of the human race. And it's the key to the future of world power. So we've been investigating that, and I'll offer a few thoughts today on some themes related to it, just to provoke a discussion, and really interested in your thoughts and feedback. And so I'm going to talk about a few things, just a few words on AI's transformative potential, just for anybody who hasn't been kind of neck deep in this already, to see what people are saying about it. Give you a couple of major challenges for governments that are coming out of this, some scenario planning we started to do, asking key questions of how U.S. government officials would respond to certain AI-driven scenarios that might come about. A few words on China's ambitions, the question of racing. As you've seen in one of the U.S. China Security Commission, or the Congressional Committee came out with a report a few months ago saying that the United States should invest in a Manhattan Project style effort to race and get to artificial general intelligence, which I think is a bad term, but super intelligence, as quickly as possible. Should we do that? What would it mean? There's a lot of talk about decisive advantage. I'll talk a little bit about that. Whoever gets to certain thresholds of AI first will enjoy decisive strategic advantage. But what is that actually? And then finally, I'll conclude with just a couple of assumptions that I think should guide U.S. strategy. So obviously, I'm just going to be saying a few words on each of these. Okay, AI's transformative potential. This is obvious. I think probably to everybody in the room, you've probably read a lot. Many of you, I'm sure, have great expertise on this, way beyond what I have. But just thinking about this in the context of, it's not the first time we have a techno-industrial revolution that is going to reshape world politics. The Industrial Revolution obviously put some countries on top. Britain, relatively small country in 1700, 1750. Nobody would have guessed that Britain was going to be the global hegemon with controlling a quarter of the Earth's surface and 25% of global manufacturing. But for a variety of reasons that are debated, but very interesting, it ends up leading the Industrial Revolution. The U.S., Germany, others are quick followers. Japan jumps on board. And in the end, you have a world politics composed of countries that are industrial powers and countries that are not. And your Ottoman empires and Austro-Hungarian empires, even Russia to a degree as kind of a half follower, simply can't keep up and pay an enormous strategic price. And so the argument is we are on the verge of a similar thing, perhaps even more profound. AI is expected to generate incredible scientific breakthroughs in a whole bunch of fields. Google Vice President for Research, James Manika, has argued that AI will make it possible to condense hundreds or even thousands of years of research into a few years, months, or even days. So as soon as you get to superintelligence, you're just going to have incredible numbers of unbelievable results coming out. You're going to solve the fusion problem. You're going to solve fundamental physics, whatever. Boosting productivity across the economy. So there's already been a bunch of studies on this. You've probably seen some of them in various areas. They find productivity effects from a few percent to 40% or higher. So if you go across an economy like that, it's an enormous advantage. Substitute for human beings in lots of jobs. Some of you may have seen Epoch AI just put out a new study last week, the week before. Now, this was a model that explicitly said, we did not take into account barriers of adoption, which means it's not a real finding in a way, because for something to propagate through an economy, it's got to have, However, based on the model they developed, they said somewhere between 2030 and 2040, based on capability advancement, they presumed, and other kinds of things, that AI would substitute for 100% of human jobs, and the share of GDP going to labor would go to 0%. Now, that is a mythical finding to a certain degree, but it gives you a sense of where the far end of some of these projections are right now. Dario Amodei of Anthropic has estimated that he thinks once it sort of propagates through the economy, it will cause economic growth of at least 10% a year in the developed world and 20% a year in the developing world. Again, these are, I sometimes call these magic wand theories of AI, because there's a lot of steps between here and there. But again, to give you a sense, new military capabilities, you've read some of the stuff about automated systems governed by AI-linked sensor networks and incredibly fast command and control that give a decisive advantage and essentially allow anybody to do to any military what the U.S. did to Iraq's military in 1990, in effect, is the idea. Transformation in institutions. So we've got our legitimation crisis in our developed societies. Well, that gets solved because now all of a sudden the DMV works and lots of other institutions are very efficient and all the cheating goes out of Medicare and everything else. So people have a new legitimacy sense of their governments. And then you have other fields that AI interacts with. Biological sciences are obviously one, quantum, nanotechnology. So people like Eric Drexler are very big on the intersection of AI and nanotech to create fundamentally new ways of actually making things, which will transform our understanding of how manufacturing happens. Now, there are an enormous number of uncertainties. Again, I'm sure folks here know more about this, much more about this than I do. The speed of model development, you've got, skeptics like Gary Marcus, but lots of others who are saying these models are much less reliable, effective than the advocates say. The speed is slowing down and plateauing to a certain degree of the advance. A lot of debate about that. Training versus inference. So in terms of money spent, compute applied, what's the balance between the two? A big thing that came up with DeepSeek was the model got overloaded in the first days because so many people, especially in China, were trying to use it. And increasingly, you have this thing of, with a finite amount of compute to go around, actually applying and using the models is going to be taking an increasing proportion. How does that play out? What does it mean for strategic advantage? Open versus proprietary models. A world of really where one of the things we've been looking into is, so the frontier proprietary models will always presumably be the most capable. But if open source is 6 months behind, 12 months behind, as has been the case, if it gets even a little bit better, the vast majority of individuals and institutions might be perfectly happy using the especially when we get down the line. The frontier models are doing astonishing things, but open source can do tremendous things. If you're a small business, if you're a big business, if you're an individual, if you're a university, you may have lots of open model applications available to you for free or low cost that will do what you need AI to do. And in that kind of a world, just as an example of this piece that came out the other day was talking about this, the United States could win the race to, or continually win the race to being ahead in the frontier models, but lose the global competition for AI because most emerging countries are going to be turning to open source things, a lot of which will be coming from China or elsewhere. The rate of AI diffusion, capability diffusion globally. So UAE is talking about $1.5 trillion of investment in the U.S. economy, a lot of it focused on technology. They have the agreement with Microsoft and their firm to do data center cooperation. They want to be a global AI powerhouse. We have our new diffusion rules that divide the world into several tiers of partners who can get various types and amounts of compute. And one assumption is they want to be a top tier country and they're using their investment to kind of leverage that. What is the US view of that? What happens if there is a frontier model being developed in UAE? Obviously, potentially in China. What about in France with Mistral and other kinds of things? So how does this diffusion shape the future? I haven't said anything yet about AI safety. Just yesterday, I guess, Google DeepMind put out a new study on this of ways to address this. In my work on competition, there's plenty of folks in at RAND working on the safety issue. I'm not one of them. So I kind of bracket it for the work I'm doing. But it has critical implications. I mean, if AI becomes the threat instead of China, that's a very different world. But in addition to that, if certain models start misbehaving and others are more reliable, that could end up being a competitive difference and advantage between the two. So all of these kind of huge uncertainties of where this is going. But just as an example, if we put aside some of the magic wand predictions and say, if AI boosts productivity by just 2% per year above current levels across the economy and economic growth by a similar increment. So if you grow at 4 versus 2%, your economy doubles in size in a little bit less than half the time. In a decade, the economy would be almost a quarter bigger than it otherwise would have been. Even those, especially at a time of what has been slowing secular growth, adding a couple, 2, 3%, even well short of 10%, play that out over a decade, and that is a tremendous strategic advantage and difference. Then you have the global network effects. So we've been worried about Huawei for a number of years. Despite our efforts, they play a central role in a lot of telecommunication networks in Germany and Brazil and lots of places. If the future global AI network, so if you're talking data, if you're model use, data centers, all kinds of applications begins to be centered around China, that's presumably very significant. 10 years from now, if one side decisively wins this AI race, they could have established a essentially permanent position as the world's biggest economy, where now, of course, there's a lot of debate about whether the Chinese economy in real sense is going to ever surpass the United States, and be growing that lead, be the unquestioned leader of world scientific and technological progress, have military capabilities that would be essentially undefendable against, and dominate digital networks around AI and all of the tentacles that then go into societies. And so all the AI effects have an American or a Chinese stamp on them. So one could make an argument if this now, there are the skeptics who say 2, 3, 5 years from now, we're going to be shaking our heads and saying, this isn't another AI winter, but there's a lot less progress than people were predicting. You talk to people in the labs who are working on the technology, they are convinced that by 2027 at the latest, they are crossing a threshold to what would be called superintelligence. Artificial general intelligence, again, I think is something that's being used a little less and less. And I'm a big advocate actually of sort of a gradualist view that says there is no one threshold for superintelligence. We already have it in certain fields. We already have it for chess. We already have it for math to a certain degree. But as you get applications that are more reliable, achieve more things, begin generating more of these outputs, you could make an argument that if we're concerned about a U.S. China rivalry, this is the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that matters because everything else will be subsumed under it. The Taiwan scenario will become a function of who is leading AI. Technology competition will become a function of who is leading. Everything will become a function of who is leading this area. That's a debatable proposition. There's reasons why it might not be true, but I think we have to take it seriously as a possibility because we assume it's not true and we get it wrong. That's a much bigger price than investing some money. Now, there's a particular aspect of this that, again, some of you, I'm sure, could lecture me for a long time about it, but this supposed takeoff scenario that some of the labs are moving toward, which is the idea that you get AI models that are good enough, as Aschenbrenner called it, to be drop-in AI researchers. So the model becomes the researcher, and now you have 1 million AI researchers working for OpenAI. In fact, I forget if it was OpenAI, one of the leading firms said just a week or so ago that within 5 years, they were planning to get rid of almost all of their human workers because they wouldn't need them because the models will be doing the AI research. So what happens then, in the view of some, is sudden, accelerating, self-propagating advancement because the models make the models better, faster than humans could do, and you have this incredible takeoff point of AI capabilities, and that becomes an inflection point of history, the greatest inflection point and competitive advantage in human history. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether there is such a thing as a momentary takeoff point like that, momentary in the matter of weeks, months, maybe even less, where they cross certain thresholds and then as the AI researchers are applied, it really takes off. This is already happening. So to me, stretching it as a little more of a gradual curve makes sense. But there's a lot of concern that there's a moment coming when one side or the other is going to cross critical thresholds first. And as I'll talk about in a few minutes, this leads in part to this paper that we did a response to by Dan Hendricks, Eric Schmidt, and Alex Wang, which argued for this MAME strategy, which is if you believe China is about to get to that point, you have to attack them. You have to attack their data centers. And they argued even including kinetic attacks. Now, my first question from my background is, what exactly are the U.S. forces that are going to go into mainland China and attack dozens of data centers widely spread across the country? I don't know if it's not a nuclear strike. But that's the kind of thinking that's going on now. And as I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, it leads to a lot of discussion of sort of stability, instability dynamics on that race. Okay, so just quickly, a couple of scenarios we've been looking at. So AI is emerging like this. It's going to have tremendous, one of my particular interests in this is, as with the Industrial Revolution, the countries that prospered in the Industrial Revolution were not always those who just got to the technology first. They were those that had societies that could incorporate that, spread it, diffuse it. Jeffrey Ding, a researcher, has talked a lot about diffusion as the key to AI power, and had strong institutions, had all kinds of aspects. And we've looked at this in some earlier RAND work on the societal foundations of national competitiveness that allowed them to kind of flex the muscles of that revolution quickly. So looking at what AI will do to societies and how to manage that, I think is part of the competitive piece. So, for example, you're a president. You've been noticing this AI thing happening. It's starting to be used in more and more fields. All of a sudden, your staff calls for an urgent meeting, and you get some projections from, I don't know, Treasury, the Fed, whoever. Okay, we haven't announced it yet, but the next quarterly unemployment rate is going to be 7.2%. And based on what we're hearing and seeing, in another 6 months, it's going to be over 10%. And our estimate is in another 2 years, it's going to be 30%. What do you do? Those are absolutely scales that, now, some of the research I've done is to look at the practical barriers and roadblocks in the way of the actual application of these technologies. Because, of course, a big lesson of techno-industrial revolutions is they take decades to play out. They don't play out in a year, right? And you can't like, you got the intersection of AI with robotics, right? You can't magically produce 30 million humanoid robots and integrate them and train people and all the rest. It takes time. But still, this could play out over a little bit of a longer period. But what would you do as president? People talk about universal basic income. Are we in a fiscal position to do that? Could you slow AI adoption? Could you propose a law that would prevent companies from replacing human workers except under a certain scale? What would you do? And one of the things that comes out of this is the levers that are available to American political leaders, short of really enormous and enormously expensive things, very limited. Related scenario. Get an urgent NSC meeting, you come in and you say, it's going to be announced tomorrow morning that the frontier model from whatever, or an open model, DeepSeek or whoever else, I think it was OpenAI, or maybe it was Anthropic. They have safety tests for their models. So they brought in DeepSeek and did a test and said it tested worse than any model they had ever tested in terms of the ability to jailbreak it and use it for all sorts of bad things. A model, so there were some reports of some weird things going on with some U.S. water systems, and that you get this briefing saying actually that was a version of Llama, a version of DeepSeek, whatever, one of the frontier models that went out of control, had a loss of control incident, and did that independently. Now, we got a hold of it within a few hours, but there's every indication that these sorts of things could continue, and the next one could kill a lot of people. What do you do? Do you send in the FBI to shut down the lab that's in charge of that model, if there is such a thing? Do you go to the leadership and say you have to turn this off for the time being? Is there ultimately some kind of kill switch for key nodes of the U.S. economy and sort of communication networks that you could? I mean, these are questions people are starting to talk about. So those kinds of enormous challenges, and between the United States and China, would one or the other prepare for them better, deal with them better? Third quick point, China's ambitions. So I'll just mention this briefly. China clearly is committed to global leadership in AI in a variety of ways. There's evidence, and so China is a bad term to use. There's no such thing as China. A lot of different people, a lot of different scientists, a lot of different senior leaders. So I'm simplifying, but there's a lot of evidence that many senior officials and corporate leaders in China are determined to achieve leadership, and it is clear that the state has a complex, multi-pronged, enormously well-funded effort to push in this direction. There seems to be evidence that at least some key figures in China do not believe that the U.S. frontier lab leadership is going to be the essential determining factor in winning this, whatever this race is. But there's a huge amount of investment. They have a new state venture fund with $138 billion that's partly going to these things, funding university research labs, heavy investment in application of AI for science in many labs in many fields, doing a multi-pronged approach to model development, not just the sort of database pre-training of most of the U.S. Leading labs, but a whole bunch of other approaches, pushing open source. So once DeepSeek came out, you had lots of places throughout China trying to show off to the central leadership that they were using this as quickly as possible. So courthouse officials in one city started applying it. There's a government helpline in another city that was transitioned to DeepSeek. Doctors at a hospital in Fuzhou started using it to propose treatment plans, just throughout. So this gets to this issue of diffusion and which of us would be better. Huge investment in robotics. Some of you probably saw the Wall Street Journal piece earlier this week. Every indication that they want to do in robotics, what they've done in electric vehicles and solar and other fields. Private sector firms, if you look, some of our folks have looked into some of what's going on there, and there's a lot written on this publicly, but all the major Chinese tech firms have big AI strategies, even apart from the ones that are actually developing models. The PLA's awareness of this is growing, as in the United States, it's lagging the private sector. One of my colleagues, Nathan Beauchamp, just did a study on AI and cognitive warfare and the way the PLA is thinking about this. Just in the last couple of days, some of you may have seen the report that schools in Beijing are now going to be implementing AI training courses at primary and secondary levels. So they are moving ahead. So next point I was going to talk about, should we race? They're racing, let's race. So people talk about a Manhattan Project style investment. I've argued, some of us have argued that that's not necessarily a good idea if you talk about it as a pull out all the stops, race as fast as possible kind of a thing. There's a big question, and I won't go into this at depth, but we've tried to think about this. What is first mover advantage in this world? If you talk about that takeoff moment, it could be very significant. There's evidence that China is very happy to do a highly skilled second mover process, but then take over certain pieces of it when they get there. Would that be good enough? So do you have to race or can you follow? If there's no single threshold for superintelligence, then you're not really racing to any one point like you were with nuclear weapons. You're just kind of keeping up. The AI researcher Dan Hendricks had a piece in The Economist just a couple of days ago talking about how he thought this was impractical and shouldn't be done. The problem is that although the US government isn't racing, the labs clearly are, right? So you've got this Stargate proposal, $500 billion. How much of it will materialize, we'll see, invested over a number of years. Just as a point of comparison, the Manhattan Project was about $2 billion at the time, which is about 35 or 40 billion today, I believe. OpenAI alone just announced a new funding round of $40 billion from SoftBank, who's going to be gathering it together. So the amounts of money that are going in this are enormous. And these firms are totally externalizing cost and risk, right? In terms of, I mean, not entirely safety. They're trying, especially Anthropic's putting effort on it. But from a national strategy standpoint, the labs are racing for their own purposes, the AI development labs. The US government is following on. Is that a model that gives us competitive advantage? Okay, just a couple points left. Decisive advantages. So there's this idea, and there's a lot of this magic wand language out there, that whoever gets to superintelligence first will be able to instantly apply, have lots of new kinds of weapons and control things and have absolute cyber power, crack the quantum problem, just be able to shut down any other military in the world. So Dan Hendricks in this piece wrote, superintelligent AI could create super weapons that blast a hole in existing deterrent strategies. So this term super weapons is used all over the place. Now, there's a lot of rhetoric, and those of us who work defense stuff keep asking, okay, what is the super weapon exactly? Now, cyber is a pretty clear case, although there's a big debate about whether AI empowers offensive or defensive cyber more. And one of my colleagues has made a strong argument for the defensive side for a variety of kind of technical reasons, but it's not clear that that's, sort of lets one side get radically ahead. But what people are increasingly trying to look at is this issue of, okay, if somebody gets to a dramatic new level of AI model capability, but they're only going to have that unique advantage for 6 months, what can they do in that 6 months that gives them a decisive strategic advantage? What could they actually apply? Could China say, okay, we're going to Taiwan, we're going to tell them to surrender, and if you try to respond, we will do X, Y, Z? Could they shut down our nuclear arsenal? Could they shut down, all conventional forces? Would they be able to prevent any kind of response? It's not, none of this is clear. And one of the issues that it raises is this issue of stability on the way to superintelligence. So we've done a lot of looking at sort of the early nuclear era and issues of stability as one side was getting a nuclear advantage. There's a lot of reasons why I think that analogy doesn't really apply to this case. This is a general purpose technology. It's just very different. As I said, Dan Hendricks and Eric Schmidt and Alex Wong made this argument that, and it was interesting to sort of talk to them and say, well, were you recommending, they had this MAME strategy, which essentially is every leading AI power should have a policy of preventing any other AI power from crossing the threshold to superintelligence with cyber attacks, sabotage, up to and including military attacks. So what you're saying essentially is, now that you've invented electrical generators, if you start to propagate them throughout your economy, we're going to attack you. It's just, to me, it just doesn't make sense because it's not a uniquely military capability. It has a lot of humane applications. So they're going to say, so we can't have superintelligence to cure cancer? What do you, Plus, your strategy assumes that we're going to use it against you. There's a question of whether, what you could actually do from a practical standpoint. But these issues of stability on the way to these thresholds are very much getting a lot of discussion now. And another scenario that we've talked about. So you're the president, there's an urgent NSC meeting, and there's a report that through some kind of innovative training program, despite our export controls, China looks likely in the next month to cross certain thresholds of capability that are going to put their best models, whatever, a year ahead of us or something. And our estimate is with those models, they could do the following things, including potentially threaten a catastrophic cyber attack that would shut down the United States as a functioning society. And we would defend to a degree, but we're not really sure how well we could do that. What do you do as president if you think this is coming? Do you just say, okay, well, accelerate our efforts? Do you say, let's build out scenarios of what they could do to us and be prepared to defend? Very, very difficult situation. All right, so finally, what do we do about this? If we don't race, we don't attack them. In a way, to me, one of the challenges is that U.S. strategic statements and documents, so Biden administration's executive orders, speeches by Jake Sullivan in particular, have really, and rightly so, because it's early, have really been focused on the technology and the technology stack. How do we stay ahead? So we want funding for the labs, we want to build out energy, we want to keep the labs safe, the security of the labs and preventing the weights from being stolen is a big deal. So there's that piece, and then there's some safety elements that go along with that. But there's a whole broad piece of like how you prepare to integrate this in societies and how you prepare supporting industries and all kinds of other things. That's a much bigger strategic question that nobody's even talking about. One of the problems we have, is common, I suppose, at these times, the amount of expertise and even awareness in the U.S. government of what's going on and what they might think about doing is absolutely minimal still. The Biden administration and now the Trump administration have certain people in certain senior positions that are incredible experts, but more broadly, just to sort of plan through this, it just isn't there. So I'll just conclude with 3 hypotheses that I think could shape our response to this more broadly as we start to think it through. And that actually is the part that I'm now really involved in, is an effort to think about the strategy for this. What is the U.S. strategy for national success, including competitive advantage, but success is more than that. And these are all my propositions, right? So based on the work we've done so far, but a lot of uncertainty. Number 1, I think a fair assumption is the AI era is likely to represent a swarm rather than a singularity. That is a profusion of different kinds of models for different tasks, models of different size and capability, open and proprietary, an incredibly complex landscape, which is a different strategic environment than one in which 1, 2, 3 labs have the models that everyone is using. And so there are many implications that stem from that, which we can talk about. I think that in any scenario other than a rapid takeoff that very, very quickly, like within months, generates decisive strategic advantages, which I think is an unlikely scenario, ultimately, application, diffusion, and use is more essential to long-term national strategic advantage than developing the models, I think. That's not to underplay the importance of the most capable models, but there are plenty of examples, from the Industrial Revolution of countries that that had scientists that were on the cutting edge, but their society just couldn't implement it properly. And I think there's worrying evidence that the Chinese system might be better at this than we are, despite our natural advantages of an open market system. And then third and finally, despite the incredible power of these models, I still think that the most sustainable sources of national competitive advantage flow from the qualities of nations that allow them to take best advantage of these transformations and moments. And in some of our early work, we identified what a bunch of those characteristics might be. But to me, that points in the direction of we need a national strategy to be more prosperous, secure, safe, and other things from the AI revolution, it's not going to be state directed, but it's got to be state catalyzed to a certain degree, I think. And we're nowhere close to that, in part because of where the government is right now. So, it could be that in another 5 years, you'll have a speaker come and say, yeah, wasn't all that AI stuff a bunch of, I have to admit, when I was at CSI, I was the editor of the Washington Quarterly. And in my great wisdom at that time, I commissioned a special set of articles for one issue on the Y2K bug and how it was about to be this threat to civilization. So maybe I have a bad track record on this, but clearly, even if you don't take the magic wand projections of this, the potential for competitive advantage from fully realizing as much as it can be realized in the next 5 years, let's say. Some of the power of this is very profound. It's going to create scenarios that we have no idea how to deal with right now. And I think there's a strong case that both in general and for competitive purposes, the United States needs to get more serious about thinking about it. So I'll stop there and take your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. That was terrific, a little bit scary, and I had REM, It's the End of the World as We Know It, kind of going through my mind as I walked over here. So
the problem is there's too many reasons why that song is true.
Yes, it is also a great song. So first we will start with Kenoi. Everyone else, I know we have some unfamiliar faces here as well. So if you'd like to get on, ask a question, just raise your hand high and I will kind of add you to the queue. But first, Kenoi.
Sure. Great talk.
Thank you.
A lot of it centers around the issue of when will advantages persist?
Yeah.
Will they endure?
Right.
Because we know that you go back and forth. Sometimes you're ahead, sometimes you're behind.
Yeah.
Let's go over your answer in the context of other answers.
Mm-hmm.
So IR, Bob Gilpin,
Yeah.
change. And he basically advanced theory that catch up was easier than staying ahead.
Yeah.
There are plenty of reasons why he argued that. And it's not a bad argument.
Yeah.
Looking back to it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The economists are always advancing their theories with much greater certainty than we do.
Yeah.
But if you turn to industrial organization and look at what they argue on oligopoly, monopoly, and the persistence of advantage, what do they argue? If scale effects, if learning effects, if network externalities, then advantages persist.
Right.
Otherwise, no. Okay? And then your argument, which is rooted in an appreciation of the specifics of AI, but let's be even more specific. You have data that is critical to be playing this game. The training data.
Right.
You have the methods used out of machine learning and other subcultures to be taking that data and transforming it into the models that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And then you have the application of the models. And your argument was, let's not ignore the last step. What about the other approaches to analyzing persistence of gaps, i.e. Gilpin and the economists? To what extent is there value in going back to those, even as we do take account of the particularities of AI?
Yeah, there's a lot of advantage. I think that some of the fast second mover arguments from economists as well as folks like Gilpin are very persuasive, partly because China's of course been playing that game in a variety of industries and is in a lot of ways playing that game right now in AI, I think. One of the challenges in answering the question is and I'm of course not familiar with all of the industrial research, but I think it's a very different question for a specific industry or application than it is for something like this. And there's so much uncertainty in the way that AI is actually going to propagate and be used. My hunch is that those characteristics for more of an oligopolistic outcome would not be met because of the just enormous range of different available applications, models, different ways that it's a general purpose technology, so it's not even really equivalent to a social media app in that sense, in terms of some of those effects that have been seen, I think, in that field. So my overall, like looking at, I think it's really useful to look at those, and even to the extent we have a bit, you know, unless you posit that there is some 6-month, 1 year, 2 year period where one side's going to make a jump and the other side's going to be watching them, and presumably the other side will also make that jump. So you're talking about this time period, right? In that time period, what happens? No one has any clue. Now, just Mike's view as a non-technologist is if that jump is a little more flattened as opposed to a complete spike with actual outputs that begin to provide tangible material competitive advantage, then I don't quite, you know what? So for that reason, I'm a little less convinced about the first mover advantages.
Talk later.
Okay.
Give way to others. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Great. Caitlin Talmadge.
So,
Hey.
I wanted to ask you about nuclear weapons
Yeah.
and AI. So what do you see as the implications of AI for nuclear stability? And are there any conditions under which or any ways in which AI can overturn or overcome the protection against conquest that nuclear armed states are believed to enjoy?
Yeah. So it's a really great question. And so we've done some work on this. I guess I would say moment there's not an obvious route by which an AI negates the potential for nuclear retaliation, particularly if you're talking, I mean, if you're talking about actual aggression against the territorial entity as opposed to extended deterrence, right? I mean, there it's just technically, and I'm trying to be careful a little bit what I talk about because some of our work has been on the high side, although it's not like it's limited what we've seen there, but I just don't. There's enough aspects that the nuclear architecture there's been such a focus on making it strong against cyber attack for such a long time anyway, that's kind of the way you get in with AI, I would think. So we've had a lot of discussions about other than, well, if it invents a cyber tool that can actually do these things, in which it would negate that. So that's one reason why I feel like for nuclear armed states, there still is likely to be that ultimate fire break against these decisive strategic effects of AI. Now, the challenge comes obviously, don't need to tell you, in, like a Taiwan contingency, where they can't necessarily have that effect on our nuclear weapons, but our nuclear escalatory posture on that was going to be very tricky anyway. And if they can achieve a bunch of other effects, even just to say on U.S. bases in the region or something like that are a step change above what we were afraid they might be able to do right now. Now you're talking about the ability to have an increment that would decisively determine the outcome of a regional conflict, even if they're not touching the nuclear weapons. So that's what I'd worry about more.
But on that latter, just to clarify, that latter scenario, you're thinking of an AI enhanced cyber.
So
I mean,
or
can you talk more about?
Yeah, to begin with, I mean,
what an AI super weapon is.
Well, and nobody really knows. I mean, the work on this is only beginning, and the sort of beyond cyber, the next sort of realm that the research has touched on so far has been in sort of autonomous systems with incredibly intelligent command and control, whose OODA loop is way inside that of the other side. To make that work, you got to have sensing. You got to know where things are. So if you don't have that, that's not going to work. There are other ways to go after communication networks that, with electronic warfare things that might be, you know what I mean? So it's not clear it's a wonder weapon, but that's kind of the next step. Now you got to make those things, but if you're talking about a 2-year window, if you've got China that's an industrial power that it is, could they say, okay, we can now, first of all, we've discovered new extra manufacturing techniques or something, so we're going to put out 10,000 of these underwater drones a year, and they can now be controlled autonomously in a way that, and they talk to each other and the AI system and all that, that it essentially the United States will not be able to operate any maritime capability within X miles of whatever. So that's kind of the next layer of it. But obviously, it takes time to build and deploy. It is still may be vulnerable to some other kind of interference. So yeah, but cyber is the place where most people presume it would start.
So Vipin Narang, you have two finger on this?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on Caleb's question. Thanks, Mike. It's so as long as, and I think the U.S. is likely to keep AI out of deployment decisions, but where AI, I think, can be potentially an enabler. I'm curious your view on this. Is ISR, self-tracking, and the U.S. has historically enjoyed an advantage in those areas
Yeah.
that allows for pressure, particularly on China.
Yeah.
With AI evolving, and are you worried about China being able to catch up and potentially threaten our ability to be able to inflict damage limitation, equal damage limitation?
Specifically in terms of subs.
Subs, but also, you still got to get, targets. You still got to get weapons on target, so that's a physical challenge that even AI can't solve.
Right.
So, I guess survivability of Ohio and Columbia is probably biggest risk. Where do you see the biggest risk for the U.S. where we've enjoyed this massive comparative advantage?
It's and obviously you've been looking at this as much, but I think it's hard to say in the sense that, so on the undersea piece, there's been some research already, obviously looking at the ways that AI could use existing data sources to make a leap in undersea detection. But it's early. Nobody knows how well it's actually going to work, what time frame it would take. Are there countermeasures, right? So it's extremely difficult to say. And there's another application people have talked about that could AI make missile defense a much more effective proposition than, yeah, right. I mean, yes and no. There's a lot of physics involved that it's not going to be able to change. So, where am I most worried? I'm most worried about cyber, just because it's the most obvious digital application, and there are some very specific ways in which it could empower offensive cyber, and kind of expand the scope of the ability to do it. I mean, cyber workforce is obviously an issue for all sides, but if you've now got an almost, an enormous, I shouldn't say infinite because it still takes inference compute, but if you have an enormous cyber workforce that can do these things constantly, it's a big deal. So that's what I'm, and everything else, it's not exactly, and particularly the decisive aspect, right? Will it give somebody a 20% improved kill probability? Okay, but right.
Especially where we've seen AI be really effective in Ukraine, for example, is
Mhm.
just a large N, and you're training the models, but we don't generate our nuclear forces, and neither does everybody else on a regular basis. So target discrimination is not all of a sudden be solved by AI the first time it happens.
No, and if you're talking about specifically nuclear, like I said, I think it's a limited.
I think it's all bullshit. There's money if you want it.
Well, on the nuclear side, maybe. I think yeah. No, I got you. No, I'm pretty much with you on that because I don't. And then when you look at the nuclear command and control system, even at the unclassed level, it's built to be like not easily shut offable. So on the nuclear side, I'm much less worried than on other things.
Thanks. I'm Simpson Garfinkel. I'm in the community. The most serious risk, I think, which is being underplayed, is cognitive warfare.
Mm-hmm.
It's today's state of the art. We can target, an adversary can target individual AI agents against every single American, find those that are, say, vulnerable to suicide, cultivate relationships with them, and have a day when 10 or 100,000 people kill themselves.
Yeah.
With the current state of the art, we can target all of the individuals involved in the nuclear deterrent and make them quit their jobs. Just make them go home. Have them all take the severance. There's so many direct attacks against individuals that are empowered by the current technology. It makes what's happening in social media much less relevant because of the ability to target person-to-person communications with deepfakes, with synthetic videos, and with things that maintain relationships over a period of time. Can I have comments on that?
Yeah, that's a happy, so many happy futures in this area. So we did a study a few years ago. We did a bunch of, well, Rand's done a lot of work on disinformation. I led a few studies, and we ended up with a study on something we called virtual societal warfare, which is very much along the lines you're talking about. There's a cognitive piece. There's also, of course, a physical piece in a world of Internet of Things. You know, everybody's refrigerator is going to order 50 cartons of eggs, smart refrigerators, right? Or all these things are going to happen. I have found, and I haven't led a study on this for a couple of years now, but at the time we were doing it, I found persuasive the idea that conscious external adversary cognitive campaigns could make some difference, but would have a difficult time radically shifting large-scale opinion in another country. But in the virtual societal warfare, we looked ahead and said, okay, what about, and if you have, and just some of you seen the last couple of days, there was a new study indicating that the best trained current therapeutic chatbot achieves some pretty good results on depression, anxiety, other things. If you have 20 million Americans using chatbots that can be hacked, even if it's not something new that's...
Don't even need to be hacked. An adversary can just have these things impersonate, that be real people.
Yeah,
Real
sure.
as anybody who you never meet face to face.
Yeah.
They can reach out to you, they can engage, they can cultivate, elucidate, and build relationships over years.
Right. So there's, it's almost like you can do an... What was that?
No.
What, Pippin?
But, or they can impersonate actual people, because
Yeah.
the deep fake technology is
Yeah.
ultimately, there's no defense against.
So yes, I think it's something we do not understand very well. I think, to me, the countervailing thing is that people are increasingly skeptical and cynical of digital interactions in other ways. And if the word got out that, you know, as it is doing with so many of us having to worry about phishing attacks and stuff like that, there's certain things you should really watch out for. This is probably not real. If you want a verified chatbot, you can get it here. There could be ways that this gets controlled, but it's absolutely the case that that is a future risk. And the thing that AI brings to it is the scale, right? The proliferation. Now, it's not free. You still have to run these models. And if you're running 1 million sophisticated chatbots to reach 1 million people or 50 million, that's a lot of compute. I think it's still a cost to be paid. Well, maybe. But anyway, it is an issue. But yeah, how it plays out, I don't think anybody knows yet.
Great. Lauren.
So thank you for this talk. I think it's really interesting to think about some of the implications here. My question has to do with really, I think, technical challenges. So my understanding is that nearly all experts, and I think the leaders of these AI companies are exceptions, profit motives, right, argue that superintelligence is impossible for a large number of reasons having to do with barriers to computing power, the ability to host servers, and limitations and training data, could go on and on. If we take superintelligence out of the equation, and agree, at least hypothetically, with that set of research, how much does the rest of this really matter, right? We have a good understanding of AI, at least to some degree now. We've seen it be diffused. A lot of the advantages that we're getting from AI will improve over time, but we're not talking about fundamentally new models. So I'm wondering if you can give us some bounds on some of your expectations, right? If we're not talking about superintelligence, what is it that we really need to do now to deal with the maybe smaller implications of AI that we can be more certain will actually have concrete effects on strategy?
Yeah. So a couple things. One, and again, obviously I'm not a technical person, but one is, from our interactions over the last year, I think it is not the case to say that only the AI lab people believe that superintelligence is a thing. There's a lot of independent researchers that believe it too. There's very big surveys that are done of folks in the field who have various probabilities by various times. And when you start getting out to 2040, 2050, you get some reasonably high probabilities. So I think there's a lot, but the second question then is, what do we mean by superintelligence? We already have it in targeted, if you're talking, so there's a variety of definitions, but essentially AGI, the classic definition has been a model that is smarter than humans for any cognitive task, essentially. But so that task wouldn't just be doing math problems. It would be reading facial cues in a visual thing. It would be making a decision for a corporation. It would be a lot of things that there's a lot of tacit knowledge, a lot of issues that, so there are definitely folks that think there may be certain categories of problem, or categories of human cognitive capacity that these models take a long time to match. Like Gary Marcus, who, he's, I guess some of the advocates sort of make fun of him sometimes, but I think he's really interesting to read. One of the biggest skeptics he always thought the Turing test was a bad thing. And he has something called a comprehension test that he's proposed, which is basically you show an AI model a television show or a movie and begin to ask it complex questions about motives and what was going on and the subtext and all kinds of things. And until we can get there, it's not really super intelligent relative to humans. So, but your question is really well taken, because one of the problems right now is that there's not, there are folks who have published different kind of ways of thinking about AGI or superintelligence in terms of different thresholds of capacity or categories. But like to your question of, okay, well, maybe it can't pass that test, but what can AI models do within a year, within 2 years, within 3 years? What applications will those have? And I think there's a strong case to be made that if you're talking about a significant productivity application across the US economy, for example, that within 2 to 3 years, you could be in a position where you'd have, with just the expected power of current models, whether you call what they can do superintelligence or not, you could be looking at some very significant outcomes. How do you characterize scientific breakthroughs? The skeptics will say, like I was just listening to a podcast with Jan LeCun, who was saying, LLMs will never be able to do really creative fundamental scientific breakthroughs, because they're repackaging information that already exists at a certain level. Now, that is how breakthroughs happen sometimes, but what kinds of advances would they push if you get 30, 40% better in cancer treatments or in some other kind of treatment? So to me, this is actually the way I'm thinking about it, which is it's not a spike upward caused by superintelligence, but it is a cascading and expanding series of applications of increasing power across society and economy that mean that in 5 years, if China does it really well and we do it really badly, we could be in a semi-permanently lag position to them. So even if you don't, so I think that gets to the spirit of your question, even if you don't assume comprehensive superintelligence, there's enough pieces that could be put in place that would make a really critical difference. That's how I would think about it.
Okay. Barry Posen.
I'm not sure if I have one question or two.
You may have two.
It's not that I'm asking for two. I'm not even sure my question is one question or two questions. This area is very, very new to me. But I think they relate, right? So maybe 15 years ago, I worked on one of these NIC open source future of studies, and it was the one that came up with this concept diffusion of power, right? We're basically looking at the saying, the gap between the very great, the middle, and the small in terms of many of the things you could do is probably compressing it.
Yeah.
It's going to compress it for a lot of reasons. And I guess I'm wondering what your intuition is about that. You said things in your talk that indicated that maybe you thought it was the case when you talked about anybody could have a reconnaissance strike complex, versus maybe it's not the case because they're a potential first mover and it accumulates whatever. My intuition, just on the basis of not much knowledge, is that it probably contributes to the former, more likely the diffusion power in the military realm. And I guess here's where I'm going to add my second question, which I think is a variant of the first and relates to your colloquy with Vip. In general, we have this problem in the military sphere of a competition between hiders and finders.
Yeah.
Right. So the question is, do do we have any intuitions yet about whether these models favor hiders versus finders? And I remember in the cyber world, in the beginning, of that interest, shall we call it, there were people would pound the table and say, cyber's offensive dominant, cyber's offensive, offense dominant.
Right.
And then suddenly you started to see this creeping counter argument
Yeah.
that was probably not the case.
Yeah.
I always suspected it was not the case, but I always believe the defense is dominant. It's just my cognitive problem, right? So I'm basically going from the diffusion of power to the particular application, and with the suspicion that it's favoring in the end, it's going to favor the defender. Right, it's gonna narrow gaps, not increase them. But I just wonder what you think.
Yeah.
My view really doesn't matter here. You really thought about this. So what is?
Well, only beyond. I mean, there's so many. Like this issue is one of 20 that we're that, and so nobody's really looking at it all that carefully. Some of our folks have been thinking about some of these things. That their work is not yet published. But so on the diffusion piece, I agree with your intuition, which is I think it narrows with the one exception that. Like I say, I've really, and partly because I've sort of come to this from these years of work we've been doing on societal competitiveness, that this technology is, achieves advantage in the context of something bigger, a military, a society, whatever. So, I don't need to tell you that, certain militaries have bought very high-end stuff that they can't use very well because they don't train well, they don't have good NCO, all these other things, right? So you could give AI models that would give some of these advantages and even help with manufacturing or whatever to certain countries, but their military capability just isn't going to grow that much because the institutions just aren't that strong. So, but where you have, if you hold other things constant, I guess I would say, I do think it's a leveling thing because more people in more countries are going to have access to cognitive capacity and even beyond that has, in the sense of like large scale problem solving and that sort of thing that's been more limited to some of the bigger powers. So, and an extension of that, of course, is non-state actors. And does this create just an incredible flowering of threats from non-state actors who can now do all kinds of things with AI models they couldn't do before? On the offense defense piece, I think it's very, I don't know that it's very contingency based. I mean, this is true of these discussions always, but like, what do you mean, what do you mean by offense and what contingency you're talking about? In a Taiwan contingency, does it favor Taiwan because it's the defender? I don't think so. Does it, so I think one potential assertion is that an AI-equipped world is one in which long-distance power projection becomes even more difficult than it is today for a variety of reasons, starting with cyber and cyber attacks on the deployment capacity of a major power, and for other reasons as well. But, and the hider-fighter thing is, I don't know what to say about it. I mean, as I say, some of our folks have been thinking about it. I can be agnostic about it and think that you can stack up ways in which it could benefit either side. I just don't know. I think it's too early to know how that's going to play out. So I have to punt on that question because on the offense defense thing, I think it's just
very. It is organizing some inquiry. That question is organizing some inquiry.
Yes.
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 Great. Diana.
Great. Thank you very much for the talk. I definitely agree with the point that AI is impacting all aspects, and precisely because of the all-encompassing impact that we may have. I find it difficult to understand what you mean precisely by one side decisively winning the AI race.
Yeah.
Do you believe there is an end game to this critical junction that you were talking about that someone is going to surpass? And it's probably unfair add on to this question. Even when we are entering this race or we're already part of this race, where does human agency enter in this?
Yeah.
Currently in this development of AI, we're still having a lot of human agency directing what the capabilities and what the applications are going to be. What about going forward?
Yeah, so on the second question first, that's obviously the billion-dollar question about AI in terms of human agency in so many different ways, but particularly in terms of national strategy, I think that's an enormous question. And making decisions in our strategy that are built around the idea of preserving human agency in important ways, and not just for like we want to maintain what it is to be human in an artificial world, science fiction kind of way. I'm thinking more practically in terms of, I mean, I'll give you an example. One of the debates about, so one of our characteristics of societal competitive advantage is what we call shared opportunity. So the more the society gets the talents out of the largest number of people, that's a competitive advantage. Okay, great. So AI is going to supercharge that, right? Because now you're going to have one-to-one education. You're going to have individuals that can use it for all kinds of things. People can, neurodivergent people will have opportunities to express their talents in ways they didn't have before. And then there's a whole growing literature talking about how in that world you have a complete collapse of human agency. Why would people care about expressing their opportunities in the way that we would traditionally think of as human capital for their economy if AI is doing all the stuff for them? So how does that play out? So those are interesting questions. On your first question, I think I agree with you entirely, which is I don't see an end point, and I mean, the basic success versus failure conception is you do not want to be so like in the Industrial Revolution, obviously you don't want to be the Ottoman Empire. You can be a fast follower and still be fine. In this kind of an environment, you don't want to be the late Cold War Soviet Union, where the other side's technological advancement is a level where you're still a viable political entity, but in a lot of ways, industrially, militarily, you're just never going to catch up. You're never going to be equivalent. I think we can avoid that outcome with, it takes real strategic choice, but we can avoid that outcome without drastic moves like trying to subvert the other side's, AI development. Of course, right now, U.S. labs are in the forefront. So the United States arguably is leading at the moment in the development of the technology. But yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I feel like, although again, it quickly gets into the, metaphysical discussions of AI and the future of humanity, dealing with how we integrate this new general purpose technology into our economy and society in stable and effective and sustainable ways is as important a strategic question as how many months lead a given model has. Because if you're talking about a sustained thing where there isn't just we're not just trying to get to the bomb first, it's a long-term thing, you have to build yourself as a sustainable competitive entity. And that's the part of AI strategy that I find mostly missing right now.
Bob Ross.
Thanks. Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate your prudence on the issue. Not common we hear that. There are two threads in your talk. One is that the nuclear break wall will not be broken, you don't think. The advantages are likely incremental over various issues. Even on the Taiwan issue, there may be certain things it could offer, but Taiwan doesn't look great anyway.
Yeah.
As far as basing in Asia, there are already the vulnerabilities are there.
Yeah.
So, and the issue of this will not be one single model, but various diffusions, and some could have capabilities elsewhere.
Yeah.
So that the challenge is not do or die existential. But then the other one is that you also suggest that American ability to compete is unclear.
Mm-hmm.
That is, the Chinese may be better at us at diffusion
Mm-hmm.
in society and within the military. They may be better than us in funding.
Mm-hmm.
They might be better organized. So, and I take those two and I put them into a context that what you're recommending sounds like what is frequently, the perspective is frequently what we hear, for example, the United States must rebuild its industrial base.
Yeah, right.
The United States must reform acquisitions of the Pentagon.
Mm-hmm.
The United States must deal with its budget crisis.
Yeah.
Well, we're not.
Yeah.
And when?
So, given that our heritage shouldn't be totally on fire, and given our ability to compete is in question,
Yeah.
how would you deal with the trends reflecting the constraints of American capability?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so a more realistic policy option, then we need to rebuild our industrial base,
Yeah.
which the former national security advisor says will be a generational endeavor.
Right.
Or the CNO said it will take generations. I mean, what should we be doing that's better reflective of the threat and our capability?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's at least a couple categories. So one is a very narrow category around model development. So a great example there that people constantly talk about is security of the labs, information security, personnel security of the labs. If another country could download, effectively get the latest OpenAI model with the weights and all of the aspects of the code, then they would just get that without having to develop it, and they could begin playing with it. So there's some narrow things around protecting your lead that make sense. I mean, partly what you're asking for is sort of a combination of what are your no regret options and hedging options that.
Also asking, let's follow through. We may not be able to keep the lead.
Yeah.
And so what would be a damage infliction capability for deterrence when we're not number one?
Okay. So that's a separate question, and that's I mean the other answer to your earlier question was this broader stuff about, you know, I'm totally with you that I'm very sick of Washington reports that say we must do X, Y, Z, especially when it's like, yeah, we've been trying to do that for 30 years. So what are you telling me, really? I think there's some much more specific things we could do if you're talking about the broader society. Like, for example, in 5 years, you could imagine American higher and, let's say, high school education being at various points on a spectrum of the effective integration of use of AI to maximize student capacity. What's going to determine where we end up on that spectrum? How much do we want to leave to chance? What specific initiatives could you take to catalyze it? So there's specifics you could come up with. In terms of your other question about like what options do we have to deter even if we're not the leader, you know, partly the answer is the answer depends on, are you talking about how gradual of a transition are you talking about? But again, to me, so much comes back to what are you talking about deterring? If you're talking about the security of the continental United States, or, you know, U.S. territory, I'm not that worried about it, because none of our rivals, quite frankly, have that much of an incentive to come after our territory. So in that sense, we've got a stable nuclear deterrent. We've got, you know, a conventional deterrent, which will be operated in whatever way they'll have to project power. So, there's some contingencies. If you're talking about North Korea, do they get equipped by somebody with AI models? They're not going to be able to integrate it in the way that China will or others will. So so really the places where you're talking about a decisive military advantage appearing over a short period of time, for me, are a couple of Indo-Pacific contingencies, and that's it. And in those, I think it will, you know, as people have been talking about in terms of South China Sea or also Taiwan, it raises some fundamental strategic questions about, if you get into that window, do you have to change your approach of what you're willing to do or not willing to do? I don't know. But so anyway, it's a narrower question, I think, than is sometimes posed.
Just a quick, so if we're number two,
Yeah.
competitive, that's okay.
It depends on what we mean by number two and competitive.
All right, we'll park that for
Yeah.
lunch.
Oh my God, what a pleasant surprise to see an old friend I haven't seen in a long time. You look exactly the same. Taylor, you're supposed to say, I do too. So I have a serious and practical question. So I'm a venture capitalist, and I spent a little bit of time in government as sort of the VC and expert in residence on the NSTC, working on bringing together industry with federally funded innovation.
Yeah.
Lab to market.
Okay.
And one of the things I discovered is this country has this amazing ecosystem of academia, government and industry that work together, but it happens on its own time.
Yeah, exactly.
On the other side, our frenemies in the world can basically say, I'm going to take you and put you here. You're fired. You're going to do this. I'm going to, raise this town because we need to put in a tech city here. So they have the ability to move faster. They're focused. They've got a long-term strategy. We're arguing here about what happened 2 administrations ago.
Yeah.
And, arguing about things that, rightly or wrongly, every 4 years, it's like it's a checkerboard. We're playing checkers on a tiddlywinks board. That's what I always say. Everybody else is playing chess. What chance do we have when we've got this great system on one hand, but, I discovered it's very hard. My job was to try to bring those 2 sides together.
Yeah.
And it's hard because it's not their mandate.
Mm-hmm.
As a VC, I will get fired if I go in too early. As government, they can't choose winners. On the other hand, your taxpayer money is funding, these amazing things at DARPA and NASA and the USDA and the DOT, which China can come and go, you know what? If she's not going to give you a term sheet, I'll give you one.
Yeah.
What do you do as a startup? You take the money.
Yeah.
That opens us up to it. So what are your thoughts about that? How do we keep up in that world? Because
I mean, I don't have a very good answer for you because I just don't know enough about that ecosystem to say anything really intelligent about the one thing I would say is, of course, our conventional wisdom has been that their system is great for forcing a lot of stuff quickly, but over the long term, they make a lot of bad bets, they waste a lot of money, they alienate people, they impose orthodoxies and ideologies, and over the long term, our messy, slower, whatever system generates more competitive advantage. A really interesting question that I haven't seen anybody look at is, do we have the long term anymore? And what is, and I mean, there's a whole question, which I'm not expert on either, is China's system is not the former Soviet Union system. It's a very different hybrid, obviously. And so the degree to which that relative advantage exists is different than it was before, plus which we're now dealing with potentially a narrow window where, so I think part of the answer would begin, which relates to so many questions, trying to get a better understanding of what that transition looks like. What would the models begin to be able to do? How would they be applied? What kind of advantages could they get over us? How might they capture certain kinds of industries, and how do we avoid that? And begin to target key investments to say, okay, a particularly high risk area is X, therefore we're going to want, and I think, to your point, there's, the DARPA model is so often referred to, but it's a useful kind of way of thinking of what the government can do to fill gaps that in that early risk-taking position that maybe others wouldn't. You could have a whole set of, from DARPA through more direct public-private partnerships on specific industrial applications, but I don't know what that would look like. I think it's actually a bigger question than AI. It's the
tech question.
It's the techno-industrial competition we're engaged in.
It underlies our economy, our status as innovation leaders.
Yeah.
Really everything.
Yeah. Right. And there's sort of like a general, as certainly elsewhere too, but certainly in Washington, there's a lot of recognition of this in the sense of, okay, we can't let this happen anymore. What they did to solar, we can't let happen again. Okay, but what does that mean in terms of going forward? And as you know very well from having, better than me, from having worked there, on these, like in defense, it is vanishingly simple compared to these issues to get the right people in a room to make a decision. And that's hard enough. On these issues, decision-making, investment, everything is spread out on these, hundreds of portfolios across multiple departments and agencies. Who has the authority to make decisions on this? When I was talking about these scenarios, you go into the Oval Office, the president will make a decision, but who's coordinating that strategy and policy in advance? Is it the NSC? Well, this is not a national security issue only, right? So how do you coordinate the U.S. government around it? Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there.
We need a task force.
Oh God, no. To say we must have a better organization. We must.
Chaired by the AI czar.
Just ask AI; it'll tell you what to do.
Great question. Eric Greenberg.
Thanks so much for the talk. You touched on this a little bit in your response to Bob's question. I'm wondering if I can push you a little bit more to talk about what this national strategy looks like. So first off, what goes into it? B, is this even feasible, right? Given A, the speed at which AI development is working and some of the interagency problems that you just discussed.
Right.
And third, if the goal is to maintain kind of a competitive advantage, can it be a national level strategy? Or it seems like it needs
Yeah.
kind of a greater kind of alliance-based or coalition dynamic.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, there's a big coalition because we haven't talked about that at all. But like, how do you think about a global network of AI power, not just US? I mean, there's UA, but also Europe. I mean, is a laggard in some ways, but has ambitions, is putting more money into it now. So like, yeah, that's a big part of any strategy. I think it's a great question. I don't have like a comprehensive answer because in terms of AI strategy, we're just now getting into really, at least our work on kind of developing that. We did do kind of a literature review looking across the world in the United States for people that have looked at this. And I was surprised to find that like 75 countries have published national AI strategies. The vast majority of all the work that's been done so far is technology focused, is a strategy for managing the technology, safety, things like that. So, and your point about time is very well taken. So obviously a decision you have to start to make is where are the places where you can make a meaningful difference given the development that's going on? Where do you risk slowing AI development, which is of course a big discussion right now in terms of some of European regulations and other things. But I do think, I sort of think of it in terms of two tiers. There's the narrow, how do we make sure we don't get leapfrogged in the technology tier, which is all the stuff people have been talking about already. And export controls is part of that. And the next big debate of export controls is inference-based export controls. Do we restrict the H20 trip and other things that are allowing them to do inference? So there's the stay ahead in the technology. And then the other tier is this bigger tier of societal competitiveness. And there, I think you could do a lot quickly, not assuming that you have all the right answers, but you are, I love this phrase from an economist, Eric Beinhocker, who writes a lot about complexity theory and economics, of a portfolio of experiments. It's not a new idea, but it's like, it's a DARPA-like approach of like, okay, AI is going to make a big difference in education and scientific research in these fields as the government, but then also helping to promote philanthropists, others. We want to begin catalyzing lots of experiments in these areas. We're gonna outline certain goals that would make sense for the nation to have in these different things. And we're going to begin to play for the breaks as they come about. And I think that's sort of a very like allow the grassroots to flourish kind of approach, as opposed to trying to like make big decisions, could be helpful. But I do think that there's a level of intentionality we need about that as a society that we are nowhere close to having.
I'm going to group two questions in the interest of time. So Ben and Eli, quickly ask your questions. Mike, you can reply to some or all of it, and we'll see how far we get.
I know people got to get out here in 2 minutes. So yeah, go ahead.
The rest of our list.
Okay, so I want to come at this from the perspective of AI safety. Let's accept for the sake of argument the premise that AI will be revolutionary, that the skeptics are wrong, and the magic wand language people are at least partially correct.
Okay.
Assuming that premise is correct, isn't AI safety issue the only issue which matters?
Yeah.
Nick Bostrom and others have warned that the emergence of artificial general intelligence poses an existential risk. And again, if intelligence equals power, superintelligence equals absolute power. So I'm curious, especially like, is framing this issue in the context of a U.S. PRC arms race detrimental to implementing the type of safety controls necessary to prevent the extinction of humanity?
Yep, gotcha.
Follow that, Eli.
I was going to ask about these studies represent these magic wand concepts.
Yeah.
What kind of assumptions go in about the level of sophistication of AI? Is it better than it is now? And do you think these are justified, or do they favor the computer school of thought about that?
Okay, I'll do that one first. The answer is that some of them are pronouncements based on people who are working on the technology rather than actual studies. Some of the studies that have been done, like the one I referred to, are, I don't know the right way to describe them exactly, but they're very stylized, abstract studies that sort of, they definitely assume higher capability. And a lot of like a lot of it goes into specific assessment of job tasks. How many looking at across specific long lists of job tasks in the economy, and imagining when AI would be able to replace some of those based on presumed increasing capability. So there's a lot of assumptions, a lot of presumptions, a lot of guesswork. And then even rolling that out, as I've said, is something that isn't really taken into account. So I treat them as just like, in the most radical world possible, you probably wouldn't even get there. But it is eye-opening to see what numbers come out when you make some of those broad assumptions, and then you scale down from there. Like the least I've seen, I think Darren Acemoglu said he anticipates AI productivity enhancement of 0.6% per year. So that's the smallest one I've seen. But yeah, there's a lot of assumptions baked in there. The answer to your question is 100% yes. And I should have said more clearly at the beginning that my limited discussion of safety is purely an artifact of the issues that I'm researching. My background, what I'm researching right now, my focus is on AI as a potential fuel of competitive advantage, and what do you do about that? And as I'm sure you're familiar, we now have a raft of studies that have begun to show the dangers of loss of control, that these models are already thinking beyond instructions they are given. They are taking autonomous action in the real world. I mean, a famous example, I think this was Ethan Mollick at Penn, who created like a code, this was like a year ago or a while ago, 9 months ago, a coding-based model, and said, offer your services on some website, and it autonomously determined that people offering services charge money. So without being instructed, it offered to charge for money and was starting to set up a way that people could pay it, and all kinds of ways in which models are. And just today, I think it was Jack Clark from Anthropic I was reading, talking about how the evidence they're seeing is that as they get more powerful, in order to get better cognitive capability, they have to get a sense that they are separate and apart from the world that they are assessing. Once that happens, whether you call it a sense of self or whatever, there's a sense of self-interest, and then you get loss of control. So it is concerning, and I won't say anything about like proportion of risk because I'm no expert. But yes, I think that the safety dialogue and the competition dialogue have to go hand in hand. And the safety demands a level of U.S. China cooperation that appears, that we've already started an AI dialogue, right? There's been a number of discussions that appears just impossible right now, given the overall relationship. But I'm totally with you.
Wonderful. Well, we're at time. This was a terrific talk. Mike, for those of you who are not familiar with his work, should know that he's able to sort of deliver insights across an astonishingly wide range of topics. And today you certainly did not disappoint. So please join me in thanking Mike for visiting today.